The floor alarm at Foster Precision Manufacturing had never gone off twice in the same shift before, not in 14 years, and on a gray Tuesday morning in March, it went off for the third time before 10 o'clock. A thin electronic shriek cutting through the hum of the stamping line while 40 workers froze mid-motion and looked up at the mezzanine office, where Dylan Foster stood with a phone pressed to his ear and his tie loosened halfway down his chest. He wasn't looking at the line. He was looking at a spreadsheet he didn't understand, open on a monitor that had belonged 3 weeks earlier to a man named Mason Carter. Below him, a quality inspector named Rosa Jimenez was holding up a titanium bracket with a hairline fracture running through its base, turning it under the light so the crack caught the glare, and she was shouting up at the office that this was the 4th bad batch since Monday, and someone needed to shut down line 2 before Foster Precision shipped 400 defective parts to Meridian Aerospace with its name stamped on every one of them. Dylan set the phone down without ending the call. His hand was shaking, just slightly, in a way that no one on the floor had ever seen from the man who used to run this line. On the other end of that phone, a Meridian procurement director was already saying the word termination, and in the parking lot outside, a delivery truck idled with a load that would now have to be turned around and driven back the way it came. Rosa dropped the bracket into a steel bin, and it landed with a sound like a bell cracking, and somewhere in that sound was the answer to a question nobody on that floor had wanted to ask 3 weeks earlier, which was simple enough to write on a napkin. What happens to a company when it throws away the one person who actually knows how it works? To find out how a floor full of good people ended up watching their company come apart in real time, and what it took to put it back together, stay with this story until the very end. If stories like this one, about people who quietly hold everything together while nobody bothers to notice, means something to you, we'd love to hear from you in the comments before we go any further. Because so many of you watching have lived some version of what's coming. There's an old argument that never really goes away in places like this. The kind of argument that splits a break room down the middle without anyone raising their voice. Whether a company belongs to the family whose name is on the building, or to the people who've spent their lives keeping the machines running underneath that name. Foster Precision was about to answer that question in the most expensive way possible. 6 weeks earlier, none of this had happened yet. Mason Carter arrived at the plant at 5:40 every morning, the same time he'd arrived for 14 years, parking in the same spot near the loading dock because it was closest to the door and because routine was the one thing he could still control. He was 41 years old, broad-shouldered in the particular way of a man who'd spent 2 decades on concrete floors. And he moved through the building with the quiet efficiency of someone who had once been so good at his job that people used to joke he could hear a bearing going bad 2 rooms away. Nobody joked about that anymore, not because it wasn't true, but because somewhere along the way, Mason had stopped being the man people bragged about and started being the man people simply relied on without thinking to say thank you. He ran the plant floor as its operations manager, though the title undersold what he actually did, which was catch the 100 small failures a day that never made it into any report because he'd already fixed them before they became a problem. He was raising his daughter, Ella, alone, 7 years old, with her mother's dark eyes and a habit of drawing pictures of the plant machinery because it was the only thing her father ever talked about at the dinner table, and every choice Mason made, every hour he worked, every promotion he quietly declined to pursue, ran through the same filter. What kept Ella safe, fed, and covered by good insurance. He never told anyone at work that reasoning. It wasn't their business, and explaining himself had never once made a hard year easier. Foster Precision Manufacturing built precision components for aerospace and heavy industrial clients, and its largest account, a $41 million annual contract with Meridian Aerospace, existed almost entirely because of tolerances that Mason's floor held tighter than any competitor in the region. The company employed 340 people across 2 shifts, and its chairman, Richard Foster, a man in his 70s who had built the place from a single stamping press 40 years earlier, had recently stepped back from daily operations, handing the CEO title to his daughter, Abigail Foster, 36 years old, sharp, exacting, and carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent 3 years trying to prove to a board of older men that she deserved the chair she was sitting in. Abigail respected competence. She also, without quite admitting it to herself, had spent her whole life being told that family came first, and when her father asked her to make room on the floor for her younger brother, Dylan, 28, restless, recently finished with an MBA, he'd taken more interest in the social calendar of than the coursework. She said yes before she let herself think too hard about what saying yes would cost. The man standing between Dylan and the corner office that Richard Foster had quietly promised his son was Mason Carter, and everyone on the floor knew it, and everyone above the floor pretended not to. Grant Whitfield, the plant's polished vice president of operations, a man who wore his loyalty to the Foster family like a second suit, and had spent years positioning himself as indispensable to Richard, understood the situation better than anyone. Grant had a long memory for a specific incident 4 years earlier, a defect in a Meridian shipment that had triggered a costly recall, an incident that Grant himself had caused by overriding one of Mason's inspection holds to hit a shipping deadline, and an incident that Grant had, through careful and unhurried corporate language in 3 separate meetings, made sure landed on Mason's record instead of his own. Mason had never fought it. He'd had a 6-month-old daughter at home, and a wife already sick with the illness that would take her 18 months later, and a fight over blame was a luxury he couldn't afford to spend his energy on. He accepted the demotion from a promised vice president, tracked down to floor operations manager, said nothing, and went back to work, because work was the only place grief couldn't quite follow him in. Grant saw an opportunity in Dylan Foster's arrival that he had been waiting 4 years for. He told Abigail, in a tone so reasonable it barely sounded like advice at all, that Mason was a fine floor supervisor, but lacked the leadership polish the company's biggest clients expected to see when they toured the plant, that Dylan needed real operational experience before he could be groomed for anything larger, and that installing him as plant manager now, while the business was stable, was the safest possible time to do it. Abigail listened to a man she trusted, about a man she barely knew beyond his production numbers, and she made the call without ever walking the floor to ask Mason a single question about how the place actually ran. On a Friday afternoon in early February, Mason was called into the glass-walled conference room on the mezzanine, and Abigail Foster told him, with the careful, rehearsed kindness of someone delivering news she hadn't examined closely enough to be uncomfortable with, that the company was restructuring plant leadership, and that Dylan would be taking over as operations manager effective Monday. She thanked Mason for his years of service. She did not ask him a single question about what that service had actually involved. Mason listened without his expression changing, the way he listened to almost everything, and when she finished, he asked only one thing: whether he could stay on in a reduced technical role, for now, so the transition wouldn't hurt the floor. Abigail said that wouldn't be necessary. Grant, sitting quietly at the end of the table, said nothing at all, and that silence would turn out to be the most expensive thing anyone in that room said that day. The demotion was framed, in the language everyone in that glass room seemed fluent in, as a lateral transition rather than a removal, but everyone on the plant floor understood exactly what it was the moment they saw Dylan Foster walking the line on Monday morning in a suit that had never once touched a factory floor, trailed by Grant Whitfield, who introduced him to each department with the practiced warmth of a man selling something. Mason was given 2 weeks to, in Abigail's words, hand off institutional knowledge, a phrase that sounded generous until you tried to compress 14 years of tacit understanding. The specific groan a press made 40 minutes before it needed recalibration, the exact vendor to call when a shipment of raw titanium came in half a degree off spec, the names of every inspector's kid, into 10 working days for a man who had never run a stamping press in his life. Mason did what he always did. He wrote everything down. He built binders. He walked Dylan through the calibration logs for line 2 and line 3, explained the early warning signs the sensors couldn't catch but a trained ear could, and introduced him to Rosa Jimenez, who had run quality control on the floor for 9 years, and who Mason told, quietly, on his last afternoon to call him directly if something went wrong that Dylan and Grant couldn't handle, because he'd rather get a phone call at midnight than read about a failure in the news. He said it without bitterness. That was the part that unsettled Rosa most, watching a man get pushed out the door and still leave his phone number behind for the people staying. The humiliation when it came quietly, the way the worst ones usually do. On Mason's final Friday, Abigail held a short all-hands meeting on the floor to formally introduce Dylan as the new operations manager, and in front of 300 employees, she thanked outgoing staff for their contributions in a single generic sentence that never once used Mason's name, an omission that Grant had suggested during a prep call that morning, framing it as a way to avoid making the transition feel like a demotion rather than what it plainly was. Mason stood near the back of the crowd, in his work jacket, holding a cardboard box with 14 years of small things in it, a coffee mug Ella had painted for him, a photo of his wife taped inside his locker door, a wrench he'd bought with his first paycheck, and he watched the CEO of the company he'd helped build thank a room full of strangers without acknowledging he existed. He didn't say anything. He walked out the loading dock doors he'd walked through at 5:40 every morning for 14 years, got in his truck, and drove home to make dinner for a 7-year-old who asked him why he was home early, and he told her that his job had changed, and that was all he said about it, because the last thing Ella needed was to learn that loyalty sometimes got repaid with a cardboard box. Nobody in that boardroom understood yet what had actually just walked out the door. Dylan Foster was not lazy, and he was not stupid, but he was 28 years old and had spent his working life in conference rooms, not on production floors. And the difference between reading a maintenance report and hearing a machine start to fail were two entirely different languages, one of which he had never learned to speak. Grant, who had engineered the whole transition to finally secure his own path toward the executive floor, discovered within days that Mason's job had never been a job at all in the way a title describes one. It had been 100 invisible corrections a day, and there was no binder thick enough to replace 14 years of a trained ear. If any of you watching have ever been the one holding everything together at work or at home while somebody else got the recognition, we'd genuinely like to hear about it in the comments, because that particular kind of invisible loyalty deserves to be spoken out loud more than it usually is. There's a version of this story where Mason should have said something, should have pushed back the moment Grant started reshaping the narrative 4 years earlier, should have fought for the record instead of swallowing it for the sake of a paycheck and a sick wife and a baby who needed stability more than her father needed to be right. And there's another version where speaking up back then would have cost him the job entirely, left Ella without insurance during the worst 18 months of both their lives. And some people watching this will believe a man should always speak the truth regardless of the cost, while others will understand exactly why he chose his daughter's stability over his own vindication. And there isn't an easy answer to which of them is right. 3 weeks would pass, 3 ordinary-looking weeks on the calendar, before the cost of what had walked out that loading dock door became impossible for anyone in the glass-walled office to ignore. The first sign was small enough that Abigail almost didn't hear about it, a single line in a weekly production summary noting that Line 2's defect rate had crept up from an average of 0.6% to just under 2%, a number that sounded unremarkable until you understood that in aerospace manufacturing, 2% on a $41 million contract was the difference between a comfortable margin and a client asking uncomfortable questions. Dylan noticed the sensors were flagging tolerance issues more frequently and, without the trained ear to know whether that meant the machine needed recalibration or the raw material batch was slightly off, he did the only thing his MBA coursework had ever really prepared him to do, which was call a meeting about it. Grant, increasingly aware that his own credibility was tied to a transition he'd personally engineered, downplayed the numbers in front of Abigail, calling it normal onboarding turbulence, the kind of dip you'd expect with any new manager finding his footing. By the second week, the defect rate had climbed past 4%, and Meridian Aerospace's quality liaison called Foster Precision directly to ask why 3 consecutive shipments had failed incoming inspection at their own facility, a call that Dylan took alone, without Grant in the room, and fumbled so badly, unable to explain the root cause because he genuinely didn't know it, that Meridian's liaison ended the call by saying she'd need to escalate the account to her director. Rosa Jimenez, watching all of this unfold on the floor she'd worked for 9 years, made the call Mason had told her to make. She didn't reach him that week. She sat with her hand on the phone twice and put it back down both times, telling herself it wasn't her place, that going around the new chain of command could cost her the job she needed just as much as Mason had needed his. And that particular fear, the fear of speaking up when speaking up might cost you something real, was its own quiet epidemic in that building, one that had nothing to do with anyone's loyalty and everything to do with how replaceable everyone below the mezzanine had been made to feel. Abigail began noticing something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with defect rates on a spreadsheet. She started walking the floor herself in the mornings, a habit she hadn't kept up in over a year, and she found herself asking line workers casual questions that circled, without her quite admitting it, back to one name. A machinist told her, unprompted, that things used to run different, that Mason could walk past line 3 and know something was wrong before the sensors caught it, that he used to eat lunch at the same table as the floor crew, instead of in the executive kitchen upstairs. A shipping coordinator mentioned that Mason had once driven 2 hours on a Saturday, unpaid, to personally deliver a rush part to a client because he didn't trust the courier service with something that mattered that much. None of it was said as a complaint about Dylan. It was said the way people talk about someone they miss, in small unprompted fragments, and each fragment landed on Abigail with a weight she hadn't expected and didn't especially want to feel, because underneath it was a question she'd been avoiding since the day she signed off on the transition. Had she actually made a decision, or had she simply trusted Grant's version of one? The secondary crisis arrived on a Thursday 3 weeks and 2 days after Mason's last shift, when Meridian Aerospace Director of Procurement called Abigail personally, not Dylan, to inform her that 400 defective titanium brackets had shipped with Foster Precision's certification stamp on them, despite failing internal quality holds. An oversight that had happened because Dylan, under pressure to hit a shipping deadline Grant had set to look good in front of the board, had done exactly what Grant himself had done 4 years earlier, and overridden an inspection flag he didn't fully understand the meaning of. The director told Abigail, in language far less careful than anything used in Foster's own boardroom, that Meridian was suspending all further shipments pending a full audit, and that the $41 million contract, the largest account the company had, was now formally under review for termination. Abigail sat alone in her office after that call for a long time. The kind of stillness that comes right before someone stops protecting an idea they've been protecting, for reasons that were never really about the idea at all. It was Priya Nandan, a young operations analyst 2 years out of college, who had quietly built her own reputation for being the only person in the building willing to actually read production logs line by line, instead of trusting the summary someone else had written, who brought Abigail the piece of the story nobody upstairs had been willing to say out loud. Priya had pulled the historical shipment records from the recall 4 years earlier, the one that had ended Mason's path toward the executive floor, and cross-referenced the override timestamps against employee badge access logs, and what the data showed, cleanly, undeniably, timestamped and impossible to argue with, was that the original override authorization on that batch had come from Grant Whitfield's login, not Mason's, 20 minutes before the shipment left the dock. Mason had flagged the batch, Mason had been overruled, and somewhere in the years since, the story had quietly rewritten itself into one where the failure belonged to the man who'd actually tried to prevent it. Abigail read the report twice at her desk that night, alone, long after the floor had gone quiet, and something in her chest tightened in a way she recognized as guilt, only because she'd felt it so rarely in her professional life that she almost didn't have a name for it. She thought about the all-hands meeting where she'd thanked outgoing staff without saying his name. She thought about the cardboard box he must have carried out the loading dock doors, and she realized she had never once, in 3 years as CEO, actually asked Mason Carter a single direct question about how her own company worked. She drove to his house the next evening, unannounced, a woman who had spent her career inside boardrooms, now standing on a stranger's porch in the cold with no idea what she was actually going to say. Mason opened the door in a flannel shirt with flour on his hands from helping Ella with a school baking project, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. The CEO who had let him go, and the man who had never once, in 14 years, asked the company for anything it didn't already owe him. Abigail told him about the audit, about the recall, about Priya's report, and she told him, with a directness that cost her something to say out loud, that she believed she had made a mistake, and that she was asking him, not ordering him, to come back. Mason listened the way he listened to everything, without his face giving much away, and when she finished, he didn't ask about title, or salary, or an apology delivered in front of the board. He said one thing, quietly, standing in his own doorway, with his daughter's laughter drifting in from the kitchen behind him, that if he came back, it would be because the floor needed him, not because the company was embarrassed, and that the first thing that had to change was that the truth about that 4-year-old recall got corrected on the record, properly, for every person who had watched him carry that blame in silence. Abigail agreed before she'd fully thought through what agreeing would cost her with her own brother, and the man who had spent years cultivating her trust. 8 days would pass before that promise collided head-on with Grant Whitfield, who had far more to lose from the truth coming out than anyone in that house yet understood. Mason returned to the plant floor on a Monday morning at 5:40, the same time he'd arrived for 14 years. And the first thing he did before he'd even taken off his jacket was walk the length of line 2 with his hand resting lightly on the housing of each machine, the way a doctor might rest 2 fingers on a pulse. And by the time he reached the end of the line, he already knew, before any sensor confirmed it, that the calibration drift causing the fracture defects wasn't coming from the press at all, but from a batch of raw titanium stock that had been sourced from a backup supplier. Dylan had approved 3 weeks earlier to hit a delivery deadline, a supplier whose alloy composition ran 0.3% outside the tolerance Meridian specifications required, a difference invisible to anyone who hadn't spent a decade learning exactly how that particular metal behaved under stress. He pulled 3 sample brackets, ran them through hardness testing himself rather than waiting for the cue, and had a definitive root cause finding on Abigail's desk before lunch, something Grant and Dylan combined hadn't managed to produce in 3 full weeks of defect reports and closed-door meetings. Rosa Jimenez cried the first morning she saw him back on the floor, and she wasn't the only one. Word moved through the building, the way it always does in a place where everyone actually knows everyone, not through an announcement, but through the quiet relief of workers who had been holding a failing operation together with nothing but their own stubbornness for 3 weeks, and finally had someone competent standing at the front of it again. Mason didn't gloat, didn't say a word about the empty office he was walking back into, didn't so much as glance toward Dylan when their paths crossed near the loading dock that first afternoon. He simply worked, the way he always had, correcting the supplier issue, personally calling Meridian's quality liaison to walk her through the root cause analysis, in language specific enough that she stopped him twice to say she'd never received an explanation that thorough from any vendor in 15 years, and by Wednesday, the defect rate on line 2 had dropped back under 1%. The reveal, when it came not from Mason but from Priya's report, which Abigail brought to a closed leadership meeting she convened specifically to walk the time-stamped badge logs and override records in front of Grant Whitfield, Dylan Foster, and her own father, Richard, whom she'd asked to attend because the truth about to surface in that room concerned a decision he had made 4 years earlier without ever hearing Mason's side of it. Grant tried at first to do what he had always done, to reframe the data in language reasonable enough to survive a boardroom, suggesting the timestamps could reflect a shared login that Mason himself may have used Grant's terminal that day. Small deflections offered with the same practiced calm that had worked on this family for years. But Priya had anticipated the objection and had pulled the physical access badge records too, showing Grant on the loading dock floor at the exact minute of the override, while Mason's badge showed him still in the quality lab 2 floors away, flagging the same batch through the proper channel 20 minutes earlier. A flag that had simply been ignored. There was no reasonable-sounding sentence left for Grant to reach for. Richard Foster, 73 years old, and rarely rattled by anything in 4 decades of running that building, sat in silence for a long moment and then asked Grant directly whether what the data showed was true. And Grant, cornered by a piece of evidence with no ambiguity left in it, finally admitted that he had made the override call under deadline pressure and had allowed the record to imply otherwise in the years since, because correcting it would have ended his own career rather than Mason's. Here is where an honest disagreement tends to surface among people who've lived through something like this themselves. Some believe a company should always promote based on measurable skill regardless of family ties, and trust in the plant floor's hard-earned competence over any credentialed newcomer's fresh theory, while others genuinely believe a founder's family has earned the right to develop the next generation of leadership inside the business they built, even if that development comes at a temporary cost. And reasonable people watching this story will land on different sides of that argument, which is exactly why it's worth saying out loud in the comments rather than assuming everyone sees it the way you do. Dylan Foster, for his part, said very little during the meeting, and what he did say surprised the room more than anything Grant confessed. He admitted, without being pushed, that he had known within his first week that he was in over his head, that he had spent 3 weeks approving decisions he didn't fully understand, because admitting confusion felt more dangerous to his standing in the family than making a wrong call quietly and hoping it worked out, and that watching Mason walk the floor that morning and diagnose in 20 minutes what he himself hadn't managed to identify in 3 weeks had been the most honest lesson anyone had ever taught him about what leadership on a factory floor actually required. It wasn't a redemption for Dylan so much as the first true thing he'd said since he'd arrived, and Abigail, watching her brother finally set down the performance he'd been putting on since February, felt something in the room shift toward a version of the truth the family had been avoiding for years. Grant Whitfield was placed on immediate administrative leave, pending the board's review. His 18 years of cultivated goodwill with the Foster family unable to survive one clean, undeniable piece of evidence. Meridian Aerospace, informed of the root cause correction and the leadership change, agreed to lift the shipment suspension pending 30 days of verified quality data, a reprieve rather than a resolution, and the $41 million contract that had come within a hair's breadth of termination now hung on Mason Carter's ability to prove, publicly and completely, that the floor was steady again. Abigail found Mason alone in the quality lab that evening, running one more test on a bracket long after everyone else had gone home, and she stood in the doorway for a moment before she spoke, watching a man work with the same quiet focus he'd always had, unchanged by any of the vindication that had just unfolded 2 floors above him. She told him what the board had decided about Grant. He nodded once and kept working, and when she asked him, almost involuntarily, why none of it, the apology, the correction, the public confirmation that he had been right all along, seemed to move him the way she'd expected it to, he set the bracket down and told her, plainly, that he hadn't come back for an apology. He'd come back because Rosa and the rest of the floor crew had needed someone, and because Ella had asked him, the night before his first shift back, whether he was scared, and he'd told her no, because the only thing that had ever scared him was not being able to take care of her, and everything else, titles, credit, 4-year-old blame that finally landed where it belonged, was just noise around the edges of that one plain fact. Abigail Foster stood in that doorway a moment longer than she needed to, long enough to notice something she hadn't let herself notice in 3 years of running that building, and neither of them said anything about it yet, because there was still a company to save, and a board meeting 6 weeks out that would decide, in front of every major client and half the regional press, whether Foster Precision Manufacturing survived the year at all. The board meeting convened on a Thursday morning in early May, 6 weeks after Mason Carter walked back onto the plant floor, and this time the conference room wasn't half empty the way it had been for Grant's quiet removal. Richard Foster had insisted, over Abigail's initial objection, that the meeting be open to the full floor leadership team and, at Mason's specific and only request, streamed to every department on the production floor itself, so that the 340 people who actually built the company's products could hear, in real time, exactly what had happened over the past 3 months and why. Abigail stood at the front of that room, in front of the board, in front of Meridian Aerospace's regional director, who had flown in personally to review the account renewal, and in front of a video feed, carrying her voice down to the floor, where Rosa Jimenez and Priya Nandan and dozens of others stood near the line to listen. She did not soften the story. She told the room plainly that the company had removed its most capable operations leader based on the recommendation of an executive who had years earlier allowed that same leader to absorb the blame for his own mistake, and that the near loss of the company's largest contract had been the direct, traceable cost of that failure. She named Mason. She said his name clearly, the way she hadn't in that all-hands meeting 3 months earlier, and she said it in front of every person whose job had depended, without most of them ever fully realizing it, on the quiet competence of one man in a work jacket. The board voted unanimously to formally reinstate Mason's 4-year-old record without the recall attached to his name, correction that Priya's time-stamped evidence made undeniable, and Meridian's director confirmed, on the spot and in front of the room, that the contract renewal would proceed at full value now that the account was back under verified leadership. Richard Foster, who had spent 4 decades building a company on the idea that the person who could keep a machine running mattered more than the person whose name was on the door, stood up unprompted and told the room that the single worst decision of his tenure as chairman had been trusting a title over a track record, and that it wouldn't happen again on his watch. Then came the part Mason had actually asked for, the part that mattered more to him than any of it. The board offered him the title Grant Whitfield had vacated, Vice President of Operations, with a salary and an office on the mezzanine that would have changed his and Ella's life in ways that were easy to imagine. Mason declined the office. He declined the corner view. What he asked for instead, standing in front of the full board with the plant floor watching over the video feed, was a formal mentorship pipeline that would train floor workers, the Rosas and the future Rosas of that building, into real operations leadership roles, funded permanently, so that the next time someone needed to run that plant, the company would already have trained the right person instead of reaching for whichever name happened to share a last name with the chairman. The board approved it inside the same meeting. Rosa Jimenez, watching from the floor, put her hand over her mouth and didn't try very hard to stop the tears. Dylan Foster asked to stay on, not in operations, but in a junior role under Mason's direct supervision, learning the floor from the ground the way his sister quietly admitted. To herself, if not yet out loud to the whole room, she probably should have insisted on from the beginning. It wasn't a redemption arc built on a single speech. It was slower than that, and more honest. A young man showing up at 5:40 every morning for weeks afterward, learning what a bearing sounded like before it failed, mostly in silence, which suited him better than the conference rooms ever had. The quiet coda arrived 4 months later, on a Saturday afternoon in September, at a small backyard gathering that had nothing to do with the company at all. Ella Carter, 8 years old now, was showing Abigail how to fold a paper airplane at a picnic table in Mason's backyard, insisting with the particular seriousness of an 8-year-old that Abigail's fold was wrong and needed to be redone. And Abigail, laughing in a way that people who'd only known her from boardrooms would barely have recognized, let the girl correct her 3 times before either of them noticed Mason watching from the porch, with something in his expression that had nothing guarded about it at all. It had taken those 4 months of Saturday visits, of Abigail learning to sit quietly at Mason's kitchen table, instead of filling every silence with something to fix, of Mason letting himself trust a woman who had once let him walk out a loading dock with a cardboard box, to arrive at that particular Saturday, and neither of them had rushed a single part of it. They married the following spring, a small ceremony in that same backyard, Ella walking down a short grass aisle, scattering flower petals from a basket her father had bought her, and Richard Foster, standing near the back with tears he made no effort to hide, told anyone who'd listen that his granddaughter, because that's exactly what he now called her, had chosen a better man for this family than he ever had the sense to choose on his own. There's a particular kind of overlooked person almost everyone has known at some point. The one who fixes things quietly and never asks to be thanked for it. The one whose absence you don't fully understand until the thing they were holding together starts to come apart in front of you. Mason Carter never raised his voice once in this entire story. He never demanded credit, never leveraged his return for more than what the people around him actually needed. And his restraint, more than anything else, is what finally made the truth impossible to ignore. The paper airplane Ella folded that Saturday afternoon still sits on a shelf in the Carter Foster house, a small, ordinary object standing in for everything that changed because one company finally learned to look past a title and see who had actually been holding it up the whole time. Has someone in your own life ever been the quiet one everyone leaned on without ever quite saying so? Someone written off or overlooked before anybody bothered to really understand what they carried? Tell us about them in the comments, even if it's only now, years later, that you're finally giving them the credit they were always owed. And if you believe the quiet, overlooked people in your own life deserve to be truly seen, we'd love for you to stay part of this story with us and subscribe, because there are so many more of these overlooked hero stories still waiting to be told, and we'd genuinely love to tell the next one with you here.